Hi, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. Our mission here at Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live well in spite of your mental health challenge by sharing insights through interviews, practical tools for living well, encouragement, and courage for overcoming all from a Christian perspective. And now, here's your host, Pastor Brad Hafes.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I'm Brad Hafes, your host. Our purpose here at Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live a faith-filled, rich, and full life in spite of having a mental health diagnosis. And are you in for a treat today? I've got a friend with me here in the studio. I've known him for over 30 years, and you might say many times in our lives we've lived as close as brothers live. I've been on their board of directors for many years. His name is Dave Anderson. And the reason I say you're in for a treat, because today we are going to empower you and help you understand that you can live a full and rich life, even if you're in the midst of a mess right now and you need a rescue. Who of us doesn't need a rescue here and there? So this is going to be a very encouraging podcast. And so I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Dave Anderson, who's been a musician and an evangelist in the Lutheran churches for years and years and years and has traveled all over the world, lots through the United States. I just welcome you, Dave.
I'm very, very glad to be here.
Yeah, and folks, you have to know one thing about Dave. He is one of 7 known survivors from a crash in the Bering Sea. And I want to get right to that. But before we do, just tell me a little bit about what you've done through your ministry and a little bit about Barb also.
Well, first of all, I'm a preacher's kid, but I don't call myself a PK. I call myself a TO. That stands for a theological offspring. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like flying first class, but you don't get there any faster, but it sounds better. And so I grew up in Minnesota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin in parsonages, since my dad was serving churches in those places. I was involved in youth ministry for about 11 years in America and some other countries, and my wife and I were married in 1975, and then we launched a concert ministry that literally took us around the world for 36 years. We did 5,600 concerts, and then she decided living out of a suitcase for that long was enough.
She finally determined that.
She did.
It took her a while.
Well, I tell you, we stayed in some interesting places over those years. And then a friend of mine joined me, and he's traveling with me now, and we're still doing concerts, and I'm up to about 6,100. But over the years, in addition to the concerts, we've published about 1 million songbooks and sponsored something called worship and music conferences and seminars and things like that. So, and then once upon a time, this hasn't anything directly to do with what you're doing, but kind of. I established a drug rehabilitation center in Los Angeles for people that were hurting in other ways. And in fact, I even lived there for a few of the months that after we started it. We were in a big old mansion in Los Angeles. So that was an interesting chapter of my life, too.
So you had a heart for people that needed rescuing.
Oh, absolutely.
Then, right?
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. You've had a heart about hurting people all of your life.
Yeah, I really have.
And you've had it and used music to minister to people.
That's true.
And you went all the way one time about almost 25 years ago to Russia, right?
Yeah, 24 years ago, we accepted an invitation to take some friends who joined us and go to a community of 3,000 people in the Russian Far East. It's the part of Russia just across the Bering Sea from Alaska. And there's an international date line, of course, in the water in the Bering Sea that separates Russia from the United States. So we crossed that date line and spent a week loving on the Russians and brought food and medicine and Bibles with them, and it was an amazing week.
Was there a woman named Rosa?
Yeah, there was a woman by the name of Rosa who I had come to understand when I was there, the head of the Communist Party in that community for 27 years. And she hated Americans and she hated America. I mean, what people during Soviet times heard and learned about America was extremely negative. I mean, they were told we all stood in food lines, all of us, everybody.
Wow.
We were all desperately poor and hungry and so forth. And so, she had no choice but to believe what she was told until she found out differently. But during that week we were there, God touched Rosa's heart in a very special way. And I was privileged to baptize her after the final service, the final rally kind of that we had. 10% of the town came to our meetings. It was really neat. Moms, dads, kids. And then the morning after our last meeting, our plane left back for Alaska. The other 3 planes stayed one more day. And we flew to an island that belongs to the United States called St. Lawrence Island. We re-entered America. And if anybody's listening and you've come through customs someplace and there's been a rigmarole and people, you got to stand in the right line, that is not what happens on St. Lawrence Island. I'll tell you that. It's Eskimo man comes out from the villages and the village and stamps your passport and says, "Welcome home." That's it.
Wow.
So it was.
So it's not real grand.
No, we didn't even get out of the plane. We just sat there while he looked at our passports. And then we took off, and the idea was to fly an hour and 15 minutes to Nome, the famous town, old gold rush town of Nome. And then we were going to refuel and head up to a village up at the Arctic Circle in Alaska to present a concert that night, but we didn't make it. 7,000 feet over the Bering Sea, the right engine on our plane quit, and 9.5 minutes later, down at 3,500 feet, the other engine quit, and then we fell 3,500 feet in 3.5 minutes, and we plowed into the ocean 90 miles an hour. I've told a lot of people that in those last 3.5 minutes, we were in a virtual glider. And if I just got quiet and didn't do anything or say anything right now, it was that quiet in the plane.
Wow.
Except we could hear little expressions of prayer. Somebody prayed, "Help us, Lord," and somebody said, "God, save us," and somebody from the back of the plane prayed, "Lord, I want to see my family again." And then my wife, Barbara, just before we hit the water 90 miles an hour, prayed the most practical prayer you could ever pray at a time like that. She prayed, "Lord, you could start the engines," which, I mean, the story is really full of miracles, but one of the great miracles would have been if the engines had started because the gas tanks were empty.
Absolutely.
So it's called fuel deprivation in the FAA language. We got out of the plane in a minute, and a minute later the plane sank.
What was the impact like when you hit the water?
We hit the water.
90 miles an hour?
We belly flopped into the ocean. There are a lot of miracles connected to this story. In fact, if somebody's listening and you want to go to YouTube, you can write "The Rescue Story" in the little blank, and you're going to see a 58-minute documentary about this whole story. In fact, you're going to even hear pilots and air traffic controllers that day talking about our situation. It's pretty dramatic. So it's The Rescue Story on YouTube.
In fact, I'll be sure to put that link in the description of this podcast.
Oh, that's good.
So and then link will be right there for them.
There's a website, too, therescuestory.com, and you can see newspaper clippings and things like that. When we hit the water, one of the miracles in the story, and there are many of them, is that the plane did not break up upon impact. It could have just cracked right open. Or a wing could have snagged one of the swells, in which case we would have sort of spiraled down into the ocean, and I would not be here sitting to tell you the story. But we belly flopped bang into the water, 90 miles an hour. We got out of the plane in a minute, and like I said, a minute later the plane sank. We did not have any life jackets or rafts, but in the plane with us, coming back from Russia, were 17 empty 5-gallon gas cans. They were just simply being brought back to Alaska so they could be used again. It was just a simple thing as that. So we grabbed the gas cans. Out the door we went. My wife, Barb, and I were the last two out of the plane. We stood on the wing for a few moments, hoping the plane was going to float. It didn't. It just disappeared. So now we're down in the water, 36, 37-degree water. We found out later how cold the water was, and we also found out later that you can live 5 to 13 minutes in 36-degree water. It's a good thing. I've said it many times, a good thing we didn't know that or we'd have died of fright.
Oh, yeah.
We separated. It was really hard. We separated almost immediately. We had no choice. The current in the water just kind of took us from here to there, and I made my way to my wife Barb once. I paddled as fast and hard as I could, but then she drifted away, and everybody else drifted in various directions. We were spotted finally after 20 minutes. There's a great story to that for another time. And 20 minutes after that, 2 commercial helicopters showed up, neither of which was equipped to rescue anyone from anything. You've all seen rescue helicopters scooping a person with a winch and a cable and a sling and a basket off of like a car in a river or in a shipwreck or something like that. That's exactly what didn't happen in our situation.
Wow.
The only equipment they brought with them were 7 body bags. So I guess I don't need to describe what they thought they were going to do. 2 helicopters, each, of course, with a pilot. One helicopter had 2 passengers. The other helicopter had 1 passenger. And mind you, these were not Coast Guard people. They had never done anything like this before. And for 25 minutes, they carried out what one magazine, aviation magazine, called the most dramatic air-sea rescue in aviation history anywhere in the world. And each of the 7 rescues is just terribly dramatic. The only place to put us down was at the top of an island 2 miles from us, an island that rises out of the ocean 760 feet. That's the equivalent to a 60-story building. Mm-hmm. So it's high. I mean, it's a mountain. It's 150 feet higher than the Washington Monument. And that's where 1 or 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us all together finally got put. And then we were transported to Nome. Doctors and nurses began working on us and bringing 7 people back to life. One of the guys in our group, before we were spotted, hollered Bible verses 2 different times. He was 23 years old. He had drifted so far from me, I have no idea where he was. But at one point he hollered, "God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble." And a little while later, he hollered a Bible verse that most of us have sung a few 100,000 times. "This is a day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." And I remember at the time thinking, that is the wrong verse. It didn't seem to be an occasion where you were, okay, I'm glad about this. Can I rejoice about this? Fact is, it was a pretty discouraging situation. This is, mind you, before we were even spotted. And we've thought a lot about that. And we've thought about how can we rejoice in the midst of an overwhelming circumstance. And there could be somebody listening right now who's in the midst of something that you feel is overwhelming. And in fact, you kind of see yourself in deep waters. The fact is that your life is in God's hands. That's what we can be glad about. And the God that controls winds and waves holds you in the center of his hands. That's a very comforting thing. And when I get to heaven, I've got an agenda. Like a lot of people have got a little list of people you want to meet and questions you want to ask. Mother Teresa one time was asked, when you stand in the presence of God for the first time, what are you going to say? She said, I'm going to say, you've got a lot of explaining to do. And you know what? For people that are suffering from mental health issues, and all of us, there are many times in our lives when we say, God, what brought this about? Why am I going through this? And we feel overwhelmed. And it's just good to know that our lives are in God's hand and he's never caught off guard. There could be somebody listening right now who's feeling as though you're all alone and nobody knows what you're going through, but God does. And as our plane was falling from the skies, we did not hear a voice from heaven that said, oops, as though, God was caught off guard. Oh, there's a plane falling from the skies going to crash into the ocean. Who knew about that? Who knew about that is spelled with a capital W. Who knew about that? God knew about that.
Yeah.
And he put into motion an incredible series of miracles. We look at them as incredible miracles.
Absolutely.
So that I could sit here right now and tell the story.
I've never asked you this in all these years of knowing you and certainly being around you guys right after this. Did you ever, first of all, you're the only known survivors ever of a plane crash in the Bering Sea or
in
not?
the Bering Sea or the Arctic Ocean. Nobody knows of any person or persons that has ever survived a plane crash or a boat accident in either the Bering Sea or the Arctic Ocean.
That in and of itself is enough to be astounded by.
In fact, an authority from the government said, we don't know if this is a one-time event or if we should rewrite the books as though it is possible to survive like this in that cold water. Well, nobody's rewritten a book.
Well, I've never asked you this. Did it cross your mind we might die?
I've been asked that question a lot of times, and I was hopeful. I had nothing to base the hope on other than the pilot said he had told the air traffic controllers what our longitude and latitude was. But here we are in the middle of nowhere in the Bering Sea. A pilot that spotted us, just to add more drama to this, was 1 hour late that day on a regularly scheduled flight. Yeah. He wasn't even supposed to be there. So God put into motion just an unbelievable number of circumstances that brought about our rescue. I thought for a time before we were spotted that this may be our final resting place. In fact, do I dare tell your listeners what I told Barb? I don't know if you know this.
No.
I said, Barb, we may not need those cemetery plots we've got in Minnesota. I did.
And that was as you were going down in the plane?
No, we were in the water. We were in the water before we were spotted. So there had to be some thoughts that this may be it. We may die here. And it's just an incredible story because we saw planes over us, fixed-wing planes, that had spotted us, but actually not until 40 minutes had gone by and the helicopter showed up did we actually know that anybody had spotted us.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just planes circling in the air, but, I mean, they didn't send us a note saying, we see you.
Well, and the reason I'm asking this is because I've never heard you say that you crashed and you were in the water and you feared that you were going to die. And the reason I say that is because I think there's something key for those of us who have a mental health issue or people who are going through any bad times in life. You didn't see your future end when that happened. The plane may have run out of gas, but you guys had not run out of hope.
No, that's right.
I think there's something key in there that for those of us who may have had bouts with mental health or problems in life, you've got to keep yourself filled up with faith, and you've got to keep yourself firmly fixed on Christ as being your hope. Because somehow I have a feeling, even if you had started to die, you would have been hopeful because you were going to heaven.
That's right.
And that kind of sure and certainty, is what keeps all of us going. I really
That's
believe.
right. None of the 7 of us were fearing death.
Mm-hmm.
We knew absolutely for sure where we were going should this be our final resting place in the middle of the Bering Sea. So that alone gave us great confidence. And we heard, the pilot say somebody knows kind of where we are. Well, that may have been the final chapter where people knew where we died. And in fact, it turned out to be that it led to our rescue.
Yeah. There's something I'd like to explore with you just a little bit, and bear with me. I don't want to invade in an area that I have knowledge of and make you tell it publicly, but I'm hoping that you'll be willing to. Once you experienced this miracle and you were rescued, it wasn't smooth sailing after that emotionally, was it?
Oh, no. We all experience post-traumatic stress disorder to one degree or another.
Yep.
And we are all wired differently. Some people in our plane crash appeared to have come out unscathed. One of the guys in our group had extreme trauma that resulted in nightmares every night for months and months and months. And my wife, Barbara, suffered from panic attacks and migraines and so forth, and clinical depression.
Right.
In case anybody's listening that is dealing with that, that was the result of the loss of serotonin in her brain. But there were in weeks and months that followed that our emotional system, mine especially, was massively affected.
Sure.
And telling the story for the first several years, of course, I couldn't get through it without a half a box of Kleenex.
Well, I remember when you came to the church that I was pastoring at that time, and we all needed Kleenex.
Yeah.
There was just, and I want to say it could have been one of your first public times of telling the story.
Could be.
It was close.
Yeah.
And here's the thing for our listeners. Some of you have had extreme trauma in your lives. And you listen to this and you think, wow, they were rescued. God did wonderful things and they should be happy. And even with that, there was trauma to the brain. Mm-hmm. There was trauma to their system. There was pain. There was stuff to work through, and they had to work through it. And they worked through it all individually in different ways. See, I think sometimes we get the idea God moves, faith happens, and we're all good. And then church people say, amen, oh, praise God, praise God. But here these guys, they were hurting. I remember taking you to some doctor's appointments in a van, the three of us, and just knowing that you were hurting because there was emotional trauma that went with all of this, much less the physical parts. And talk about physical, the trauma itself most likely changed everybody's brains just a little bit.
Oh, I'm sure.
And because, see, those of you who are listening, please understand, it's okay. God can do all kinds of miracles, and he does all the time. But he also has given us medicine. He's given us ways of coping and working through things so that we might thrive. And he wants to do that. And there's no shame in him doing that, especially if you've had a traumatic childhood or you haven't had a chance to work through any of the trauma. It's okay to work through those things, because then through working through them, there's really a story there, Dave, then, right?
Yeah, and it's just such a great thing to reach out for help and to say, I need help.
Yeah.
I cannot do this myself. Barb and I ended up with a psychiatrist in Phoenix for a number of months. And I never thought I would be sitting in a psychiatrist's office in my entire life. I thought, why would I do that?
Well, you're Mr. Positive.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But we did. It was a marvelous experience to sort of unravel the trauma of what we had experienced, and then to say, well, how has this changed our lives, or how has this impacted us? Can we believe, do we have greater faith today than we did before? Are we more convinced than ever that God's a God of the impossible? God's a God of miracles? And the answer is yes, and yes, and yes. Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad to be able to share this story with your listeners.
Yeah. Speaking of our listeners, just speak to that listener right now who feels like they're in a mess, that they don't know if the helicopter's coming to get them or not.
And I'd just like to pray about that. Is that all right? Yep. Oh, Lord. Yep. Father, you know the storms that encompass us. You know the storms that people are in right now. You know how the winds are blowing, and you know how deep the waves are. And you know that some just feel like they're drowning and they're about to be in deep waters, or maybe they are already. But you're the God of the winds and the waves, and we're asking you to bring peace to the storm, to calm the waves and calm the storm, and bring about healing and hope in the lives of people who are struggling with a mood disorder of some kind, a mental illness of some kind, a discouragement of some kind, a failing of some kind. Lord, you're the God of healing, and you're the God of putting people back together in incredible ways, and we're asking you to do that. We thank you that you're the God of rescue, that on the cross, first and foremost, you rescued us. You paid the price that none of us could ever pay. Our sins are forgiven. The slate is clean. And we are bound for heaven, either right now or sometime soon or sometime in the future. And that is what is awaiting us, and we thank you for that. I want to pray a blessing on those who are listening right now, that they hear this message and they understand again that you're the God of rescue for them, and I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. And know this, my friend, it doesn't matter how deep that water is. And you may have even taken in some water in your lungs already and feeling as though you can't breathe. God can take care of it. And I trust that this has been encouraging to you. And if you'd like to write us, and even if you'd like me to pass something along to Dave and Barb, I'd be happy to do that. Just write me at pastorbrad@freshhope.us, pastorbrad@freshhope.us. Well, my friend, we want to thank you for listening to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. Dave, I thank you very much for being here today. I thank you for sharing from your heart. Also tell Barb thank you for letting the story be told.
I'll do that.
Well, we'd really like to hear from each of you as one of our listeners. You can email us with comments, questions, or insights, and we'll answer questions on the program and share comments and insights with other listeners. You can even leave a voicemail on our podcast website at freshhopeformentalhealth.com. And we'd like to connect with you through all the social media channels and all those kinds of things. We've got YouTube videos and other videos. We've even got an app now. If you go into the Android store or to the iTunes store and just type in Fresh Hope, it's a free app that has all of our resources for you. And would you mind doing me a favor if you're receiving our podcast through iTunes? Just write an honest review of the program there. It helps other listeners find us. Also, if you'd like group support at getting through, and group support can be part of the rescue plan for God's plan for each of us. In doing so, you can go to our website and just look under Find a Group. You'll see all kinds of groups that meet across the United States and England, Guam, and Canada. And we have some online groups and a new one starting for people who have co-occurring and coexisting diagnoses. So be sure and tell your friends about this program. Well, until next time, may the Lord fill you with His hope fresh and new daily. I'm Brad Hafes, and this has been another edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health.
Thank you for listening to Fresh Hope for Mental Health. If you have an opportunity, please review, share, and subscribe to the Fresh Hope for Mental Health podcast on iTunes or on the service that you use. We encourage you to share our podcast on social media with your friends and family. Previous podcasts of Fresh Hope for Mental Health can be found at freshhopeformentalhealth.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. Fresh Hope is one of the leading networks of faith-based peer support groups internationally. For more information about Fresh Hope, go to freshhope.us.